We need to talk about conservatism and pragmatism. Now, if I can be a little bit biased here, I like writing essays about conservatism, not because necessarily I'm particularly conservative or not particularly conservative, but it always just feels that there's a bit more to talk about when it comes to conservatism, because you've got all these questions such as like, well, is it really an ideology? You've got three types rather than two when you talk about liberalism. You've got you've got these very, very different approaches from the new right and traditional and one nation. So you've got an obvious contrast. You can bring in a lot of your knowledge of liberalism when talking about Ayn Rand and Nozick and things like that. And it just feels like there's a lot more kind of like meaty stuff to get into. When you're writing about liberalism, you've got, some really important core values, and liberalism has literally changed the world. I'm not talking about the importance of the ideology, but just when it comes to writing an essay, I always feel I've got more to go with when it comes to a conservative essay. And this question is, I think, one of my favourites. To what extent are conservatives pragmatic? To what extent are they practical? To what extent are they based on things that they already know, that they've already experienced? To what extent are they willing to be flexible based on circumstances? Or, alternatively, because you've got to think, well, what's the opposite if they're not pragmatic? To what extent are they fixed, rigid, ideological? And then this essay, once you start to think of it in those terms, kind of starts to write itself, because you've got the new right, which is a lot more ideological in its view, because it's got those kind of liberal threads. They are a lot more kind of fixed in their ways. Think about how perhaps inflexible Thatcher was, or kind of at least claimed to be, versus the kind of the pragmatic, let's change to conserve, let's try and keep things the way they are, let's keep the boat afloat, Michael Oakeshott, all those kind of things. You've got these clear ideas. So all we then need to do is kind of think about, well, do I think they are pragmatic or not? And then you can kind of pick a direction. And the other reason why I like this question is because it gives us an opportunity to give an essay which is a little bit more interesting than just they agree or they disagree. You could kind of say, well, something like, well, actually traditional conservatism and one nation conservatism are incredibly pragmatic, but actually the new right is not pragmatic at all. They're very ideological, or something like that. Or, and I'll give you some other suggestions later for how you can kind of come up with a more interesting direction. I think for me, it just gives an opportunity to really kind of show off your knowledge of the ideology and go beyond just a straight, they agree more or they disagree more. It's one of those questions where you can think, oh, okay, cool. Let's really kind of put something together here. Right. So what have we got? So because this is a slightly more unusual... hang on, what's happened here? Yeah. So that first line there is wrong about the straightforward, do they agree or disagree more debate. Let me get rid of that one. I've thought I'd start with this direction and structure here, because it's a slightly awkward one, because as I've just kind of said in the introduction, the new right is not really pragmatic. You can give some ideas of pragmatism in there, but in short, what you've basically got is traditional and one nation are pragmatic, and the new right are not. Whereas in a previous essay, we've kind of talked about agreements versus disagreements. Here we've more kind of got three strands of the ideology, where two strands are and one strand isn't. And of course, that will affect how we structure our essay and how we think about answering the question. And you can see this here, however, because I've said here, this is a straightforward, do they agree or disagree more debate. It's a straightforward, are they pragmatic or are they not pragmatic debate, yeah? However, the agreements are nearly all between the traditional and one nation, and the disagreements are nearly all with the new right. So you can't really write a paragraph that says, well, all conservatives are pragmatic because they ... That's not really going to fit here, and that doesn't make this essay harder. Once you know what you're talking about, this doesn't make this a harder essay. It just means that the structure that you might use on a to what extent do liberals agree about the economy, to go back to the essay I just did, doesn't really work here. So the old structure of agreements, disagreements, and analysis perhaps doesn't really work. So what you could do is show, here is the pragmatic ones, looking at the agreements between traditional and one nation, but then here is the new right. Or, again, my more favoured structure would be to go thematically. What do they think about human nature? Are they pragmatic about human nature? Are they pragmatic about the state? Are they pragmatic about the economy? Something like that, I think, would be a really interesting structure that would enable you to kind of say, well, actually, if we just look at human nature for a minute, we can kind of say, well, some conservatives are very pragmatic when it comes to human nature. They have a very negative view. They think that we are very much life is brutish and short. John Hobbes, blah 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 blah. They have a very negative view, blah blah blah. But actually, other conservatives have a less pragmatic view about human nature, thinking that we are actually rational, capable of self-improvement, believing in individualism, and bringing that. And so you're kind of showing, that there is some pragmatic views about human nature, but then there are also other views which are not so pragmatic, going kind of theme by theme. So this can be a very broad question with lots of opportunities to bring in many threads, historical examples, key thinkers, contrasts, and debaters. I mean, this debates. Sorry, this is the other reason why I like this pragmatic question. Is it enables you to bring in almost all of conservatism. Really, do they take a pragmatic approach to society or not? Do they take a pragmatic approach to the economy or not? There's lots to talk about, and it can lead, as I said in my introduction, it can lead to interesting conclusions that break the simple agree and disagree mold. So in case you haven't got it, I'm a bit of a fan of this question, really. So where are they pragmatic? Where are they pragmatic? Well, many conservatives believe that their pragmatic views stems from this idea of human imperfection. We suck, or at the very least, we have a kind of a competitive, selfish nature. There is a big reliance on empiricism, which is the kind of like what has been experienced before. If you think about Michael Oakeshott's recipe book, the experienced chef is better than the kind of the recipe book, because they have experience of what kind of has happened before. Burke very much was in favor of empiricism in terms of things that have worked in the past. There's this whole change to conserve. Sorry, that should be conserve, not conservatism. The whole change to conserve pragmatism is a core part of Burke's ideas, and you can give so many examples here. Bring in the historical examples. Don't think that a political ideas essay always has to be theoretical, because I know it's a political idea, but bring in, this is where conservatives really were pragmatic, when they got involved in abolishing slavery, when they brought in the Factory Acts, when they changed the voting laws, when they I put the example on my conservative slides. Look at the One Nation stuff, especially. They were willing to change and adapt their views to improve to keep the country together, to keep the country stable. The approach must be adapted. When Disraeli said, "The palace is not safe when the cottage is not happy." If you think about that as a kind of a principle, you can kind of say, well, this is a very pragmatic, practical way of approaching politics. A huge rejection of ideology. If you think about pragmatism and ideology as opposites, do you believe in these like wonderful ideas about how the world should be, or are you very practical in dealing with the here and now? You can kind of say, well, actually, it's Oakeshott is very anti-ideology. I think Burke is also the same. This kind of abstract thinking. I think Oakeshott says at one point that being ideological leads to disappointment and frustration, because you never kind of get there. You never have an acceptance and happiness of the kind of the here and now. So you can bring that in here. There's an acceptance in traditional and one nation conservatism of a kind of Keynesian style one nation mixed economy. If you think about the post-war consensus between 1945 and 1980, they were kind of happy to go along with some of the more kind of left-wing views. They kind of kept the NHS, again, very pragmatic approach, just kind of like, if it's working, let's not change it. Let's keep kind of businesses going. And this idea of noblesse oblige, of we have a responsibility, especially in one nation, we have a responsibility to the to the lower classes, or the upper classes have a responsibility to the lower classes to enable them to maybe not succeed, but not to be suffering and struggling. So there's loads to say there about pragmatism, and some here you'd say is very traditional. So the stemming from human perfection is very traditional, but you can see here I've mentioned Israelis, so we've got kind of one nation in there again. So if when writing about pragmatism, I would be arguing probably that the tradition and the one nation broadly agree, but perhaps the one nation goes further or changes slightly when it comes to certain elements. But I would be saying broadly agree. But the opposite, being pragmatic, perhaps, is this ideological form, which is almost exclusively the new right, where it has this big neoliberal thread. There's a rejection of compromise and mixed economy. Think about when Thatcher comes in 1980. She privatizes as much as she possibly can, and she is not willing to compromise on cuts very much. You can get into your political history if you want. But you've basically got a complete change of attitude here of this is what we believe it should be, and we are going to do it, which people like Oakeshott, I think, would be a bit like, whoa, where's that come from? And of course, illustrate this by talking about Ayn Rand and Robert Nozick. Talk about their attitudes towards the economy, taxation equaling theft, and objectivism, all those kind of things. So you've then got this kind of rationalism and human nature debate. Are human beings do we have a negative view of human nature, or actually are we capable of improving and bettering ourselves? So one's kind of a pragmatic approach to humans, like, okay, they're going to need a strong authoritative government, they're going to need people to kind of keep them in check, or actually do we set them free in the economy and believe that they can use their talents to succeed in a kind of a meritocracy? Think kind of ruling classes hierarchy versus meritocracy style. As long as you keep taking it back to this idea of pragmatism or pragmatic approach to human nature or ideological view to human nature, it's relevant. If you think again, Ayn Rand, you've got this idea of atomism and objectivism. My focus should be on myself, and you kind of think of that versus the idea of organic society. Everyone kind of has their role, and we all kind of together. Significant change brought by the new right leaders. You've got that kind of change to conserve idea versus the Thatcher revolution. Like, it's often described as the Thatcher revolution or the Thatcher economic revolution. These are huge changes that were brought in by the new right leaders in both America and in the UK. They ideologically believed in a small government. With this essay, of course, keep bringing everything back to pragmatism. This is not a pragmatic approach, it is an ideological approach. And I've already mentioned here this unwillingness to compromise by figures like Thatcher, perhaps again, is not a pragmatic approach. A principled belief, not a pragmatic belief, but a principled belief in free markets and individual freedom. And I put COVID there in brackets to remind me that even in the last couple of years, many conservatives were saying we cannot impose things like masks and vaccines and lockdowns. We ideologically believe in freedoms for citizens. There was an idea. I think it was Jacob Rees-Mogg was talking about. We have to allow people to make these decisions for themselves. And I remember thinking that is an ideological approach. I believe that you should make this decision for yourself versus a pragmatic. You're going to have to stay at home because we need to kind of stop this disease. The two forms of conservatism very much there in on display. However, you can play with this question even more. So at the moment, I've kind of made the case that traditional and one nation are pragmatic, and the new right is not pragmatic. And you could end your essay there, really. You can kind of say, look, these two types are, this one type isn't. As long as you make that argument clear, you can do it. But you can go even further with this essay to show an even more interesting understanding. Could it be argued that the new right was actually a pragmatic approach to the dire situation in the 1970s? Hopefully, if I say to you words like winter of discontent, the 3-day week, miners' strikes, stagflation, economic decline of the UK, is it possible to argue that although that this was actually an extreme form of change to conserve? Is it possible to argue that actually the situation had reached a point that pragmatically there had to be a change, in which case conservatism is still pragmatic? as a whole. Could it be argued that the new right actually was very pragmatic? Can we bring in things like, well, Thatcher was stockpiling coal so she could deal with the miners, pragmatic approaches. The Conservatives in 2010 were willing to form a coalition with the Liberal Democrats in order to govern and rule, and then they brought in some new right style austerity cuts, but combined it with some Liberal Democrat ideas to kind of make it work. Can you actually argue that new right Conservatives are very capable, not only capable of being pragmatic, but actually are pragmatic on a regular basis in order to kind of get their views across? You can argue that there's a pragmatism in all of these. And one thing that we haven't really mentioned yet, and it's easy to forget this actually, remember that the new right combines neoliberal economics with neoconservative traditional social values, looking at things like morality and religion and traditional institutions. Could it be argued that the traditional social values found in conservatism are in fact ideological rather than pragmatic? So, for example, can you say, well, actually, so conservatives are often seen as being perhaps progressive views on things like transgender and gay rights and things like that. That's not a hard and fast rule because David Cameron actually brought in gay marriage, but broadly speaking, conservatives tend to be more in favour of traditional social values. You could argue that actually that is quite an ideological view to be traditional like that. Or you could argue the other way. You could say, well, actually, although the new right has this ideological ebb, it still is very pragmatic when it still has a lot in common with traditional conservatism when it comes to its view on kind of social values. There's just a lot to kind of play with here. And so I'm not saying to you in this particular video, here is your perfect essay plan, because at the end of the day, it needs to be your essay. But what I am saying to you here is there is lots that you could bring into this essay, lots of different ways to play with the information. And this goes for any politics essay. But when you see that question, the first thing you need to do is think. What do you actually think? What is actually true? What are the ideas you can bring in? Impress that examiner by not just giving me a formulaic, here's some agreement, here's some disagreement, type essay, but actually really kind of saying, well, you know what, the answer to this is quite complex. Ultimately, I think this more than this, but this is why it's a complex idea. And this question really does allow you to do that and to enjoy the kind of, if enjoy is the wrong word, but enjoy playing with the ideas in the essay. So I hope that's given you lots of things to think about with this essay. If you were going to write it again, what ideas would you bring in? What argument overall would you make? And I think that's the key. I think that's the key point with this essay, is that if you go back to this, you've got all the information there, but how are you going to structure this? And how are you going to structure this, and how are you going to argue this, and what is going to be, it can lead to interesting conclusions that break the simple agree or disagree mold. There are lots of different ways you could go in this essay, with lots of really interesting thinkers you can bring in, and ideas from thinkers to kind of make this case. So think about it. Think about what you think, and think about how you could make a very intelligent, interesting essay, because this is a good one to pick in an exam if something like this came up, because there's so many ways you can go with it. Anyway, I'm now repeating myself. If you like the video, then please like it. If you watch lots of these videos, then please subscribe, and I will see you soon. Bye bye.